Welcome, friends, to the Dr. Pontificus podcast. I am your humble host, the eponymous Pontificus himself, overly emphatic voice of reason and compassion in this circus of chaos we affectionately call the American culture. And today, we're going to discuss the notorious culture of cruelty, America's playground of sadomasochism, what it is, where it comes from, and what to do about it. Can we hope to survive? Stay tuned and see. Here in America, the culture of cruelty is everywhere around us. This is a value system where cruelty, mean-spiritedness, hatred, conflict, and suffering are seen as good things, not just an inevitable facet of human existence, a necessary evil, but something that should be actively encouraged, embraced, and promoted throughout the culture. This is, of course, insane, but at the same time, it is not unheard of. In fact, the culture of cruelty has a very, very long history that goes back, probably to the beginnings of human existence. However, in more modern times, you can really trace its identity back to social Darwinism, which is something that was formulated by Herbert Spencer in the 1800s, and this is an idea that comes out of the Industrial Revolution. So, what Spencer did was take the idea of evolution from Charles Darwin and apply it completely out of context. Now, of course, evolution itself is something that happens over long periods of time. I mean, hundreds of thousands of years. It's about how species adapt to their environment. And because every individual in a species is a little bit different, some are going to be a little bit better fit to the environment than others, and therefore they're going to be more likely to pass on their genes to the next generation. And so very, very slowly and incrementally, you see changes in a species that make them more adapted to their surroundings. All right? And that's a basic fundamental idea in biology. But what Spencer did was transfer it from biology over into economics and sociology, from the eons of geological time to the decades of human history where it doesn't actually belong. And so he's the one who coined the phrase, the survival of the fittest. Now, usually we associate the word fit with being big and strong, but fit here means fitting in with whatever is called for in the environment. And so for Spencer, fit meant being a good fit for the volatile competitive environment of the Industrial Revolution. So fit means, smarter, more diligent, more ruthless, more able to persevere, to conquer and control and dominate, be a big, bad baron of industry. Sound familiar? It's a celebration of alpha values, and that's what social Darwinism is. It's yet another example of how alphas take their value system and lift it up as the standard for all human behavior. They're using social Darwinism to give their culture of cruelty the aura of natural law, to justify the pain and suffering they inflict on the rest of us as not only deserved, but really as self-inflicted. So let's let the poster child of social Darwinism, Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge, sum it all up for us, shall we?
Are there no prisons?
Plenty of prisons.
And the union workhouses, are they still in operation?
They are. I wish I could say they were not.
And the treadmill and the poor law, they're still in full vigor, I presume?
Both very busy, sir.
Oh, from what you said at first, I was afraid that something had happened to stop them in their useful course. I'm very glad to hear it. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. Those who are badly off must go there.
Many can't go there, and some would rather die.
If they would rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population.
And of course, Charles Dickens was keenly aware of the culture of cruelty and the fundamental immorality of social Darwinism. And so the basic theory of social Darwinism is that everyone is in a never-ending struggle for survival. There aren't enough resources to go around, and therefore everyone's having to get at each other or get over each other in order to get to resources. And the people who succeed at doing that are better or more fit than the people who don't. So, in the struggle for survival, everyone is being tested for worthiness, proving whether or not they deserve to survive. And of course, the only way to test whether someone is worthy or not is put them through lots of pain and suffering. And the people who are able to endure that and surpass that, or maybe honestly even inflict pain and suffering on others, are obviously better suited to get the rewards of society and the resources of the environment than those who cannot. And because this big gauntlet of pain and suffering is grounded in the natural process of evolution, therefore it's unnatural to interfere with this sacred process of weeding out the weaklings and rewarding the naturally selected few. See how it works? Well, that whole line of thinking is ridiculous and completely untrue. And that brings us to Friedrich Nietzsche, bless his heart. So, Nietzsche was very obsessed with alphas. His notion of the will to power is that we should give in to the part of ourselves that wants to dominate everything and everyone around us, and that instinct should be encouraged and glorified in society, and that's what makes people great, what makes nations great, right? So you can see why the Nazis really loved him, but you don't have to be a Nazi to see how many cultures have embraced this will to power, including our own. And of course, out of this comes Nietzsche's famous phrase, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." What? I'm sorry, Nietzsche. Love reading you, but you are insane. And of course, Nietzsche did, in fact, go insane. Not that all of his work was crazy, but this is completely sadomasochistic, period. And of course, Herbert Spencer's work and the whole notion of social Darwinism has been thoroughly refuted over and over and over again. In fact, it was refuted in its own time by a great proponent of Charles Darwin, T.H. Huxley, who fought for acceptance of the theory of evolution against, religious forces mostly. And he wrote a book called Evolution and Ethics, which says that the survival of the fittest is basically an immoral concept, that this everyone against everything, this dog-eat-dog world of nature is actually not moral in a human sense, that we as human beings have risen above that, and being kind to each other, having feelings of dignity and respect for each other, having compassion and cooperation, this is what makes us civilized, not what happens in nature, with animals. So this notion that the state of civilization should be modeled after the state of nature, the struggle for survival, this idea has been thoroughly discredited from the minute it was brought up. Nonetheless, you hear the same arguments from the 1800s come up over and over and over again in rabid right-wing rhetoric. In fact, you can make the case that the whole history of civilization, including the development of human rights and civil rights and social institutions, is the progress from living in a world dominated by the survival of the fittest to living in a world where we support, care for, and cooperate with each other. That's what it really means to be civilized. And so people who are promoting the culture of cruelty are, in fact, making us evolve backwards, back to being animals. The culture of cruelty says that we need to make things more miserable. It's for our own good. And that, my friends, is insane. All right, enough history. Let's look at the way the culture of cruelty is expressed by ordinary people these days. Not alphas, not the barons of industry, just regular folks who have bought into the rabid right-wing worldview for whatever reason. Now listen, No one wakes up thinking, who can I oppress today? Well, almost no one. No one thinks of themselves as selfish or racist or sexist or classist or evil. Instead, they all employ the miraculous power of rationalization. They feel, in fact, that they are the oppressed ones, that they can't say these things out loud because when other people become alarmed about things like, I don't know, hate speech, then they feel like they're being censored, made to feel ashamed of their beliefs. Poor babies. Which is ironic because, as far as I can see, the conservatives are pretty loud about everything they believe these days. Now, I wish progressives had so much power that we could actually make conservatives feel ashamed of the things that they say, but we don't. Because if we did, the world would be a much better place, and it's not. So, allow me to share with you some of the rationalizations that I personally have heard from people that I work with. Now, I'm a public school teacher, and so these are fellow teachers who are teaching children. And so, once you get a couple of beers in these people, they just start unleashing all of this dark, toxic stuff they're holding inside. And I hear the same sorts of arguments over and over again in all the various outlets for rabid right talking points. This stuff has been in circulation for quite a while. And if conservatives can do anything, it is stay on message. So there's obviously this dark reservoir on the web, on AM talk radio, on Fox News, on shortwave bands, a completely alternative information parallel universe where they're getting all fed these arguments, these anecdotes and talking points. But I think really some of these rationalizations have been around for a long time, before the Civil War even, and that they just keep circulating in the right-wing communities, amplified by social media and all of our communication technology. So I'm having beers with my co-teachers. And I soon find out that I am utterly alone with my progressive beliefs. One of them, ex-military, radical libertarian, loves to rail against the welfare system and government programs, which is ironic since we, work for the government. And he said, quote, "As long as they're not starving, they have nothing to complain about," unquote. So, who are they? Obviously, the poor, but really, what kept coming to the surface, was that they were kind of talking about Black people. And I see this a lot. The shadowy Pandora's box of racism just lurking right under the surface, waiting for a safe moment to come to light. So it's covered up with this argument about relative wealth and poverty, and that's a legitimate economic term. So absolute poverty would be where you're below the level of being able to sustain your existence. Then relative poverty is where maybe you've got enough to get by on, but the average standard of living that you see around you is higher, and since yours is below that, you feel deprived by comparison. Therefore, you aspire to more things, and if you don't have access to those things, then you feel victimized. And so, well, that almost seems like a real argument that people should be happy with what they have and stop wanting things they don't deserve. And there's problems with that whole victim blaming thing. But the real problem here is that to set starvation as your threshold of moral obligation is kind of evil and certainly unfeeling. And we do have a lot of affluence in this country, and it's paraded before us all the time. But I would really flip the idea of relative poverty and wealth and entitlement on its head and say the problem is the entitlement of the rich, where they have more money than I would know what to do with, honestly. And yet, they're really worried about losing some small fraction of it to things like taxes because they have so much more to lose. And of course, their sense of entitlement comes from this insane fact that they feel like they have worked harder, or that they are smarter, or that they are more enterprising than the rest of us, and therefore they deserve this insane amount of power, privilege, and wealth. And I can certainly make an argument that that is not necessarily true. So again, you see this inversion of morals, protecting people who have everything and attacking people who are struggling while dismissing their pain. So, another argument I heard is that the poor are like drug addicts. They just take and take and take, and they never give anything back. In fact, they're addicted to handouts, to welfare. Now, if you have a family member that's a drug addict, it's true. Sometimes you can't trust them. You have to hide your money. They lie, they cheat, they steal. They have a legitimate problem. And if they don't get help, you will eventually need to sort of throw them out to protect yourself, even if they end up on the street and die from their addiction. So, this is a problem on two levels. First of all, it's insulting to the poor, but also it's a complete misunderstanding of drug addiction as well. It's a false analogy. Most people who are poor are trying. They're working hard. They're working sometimes multiple jobs, and they're still not making ends meet. I've been there. And they do not want to be on welfare. A lot of people just go through hard times. They get on welfare for a little bit. Then once they've righted the ship, they get off welfare. And I'm frankly one of those people. I was on food stamps when I was in a really bad snag, and I was only on it for a few months. And then I got off once I got back on my feet, and that's really where it's at. Plus, and I'll say this over and over again, if you've ever actually worked with the poor, either volunteering at food banks or any number of charitable organizations that help with the poor, what the poor want most is dignity. They don't want to feel judged for not being able to provide for themselves or their families. And so, if they were just these drug addicts that were just sucking up public assistance, then they wouldn't care about dignity and they wouldn't care about being judged. They want to do right. They're just not in a place to do it. And honestly, that's because the system is often not allowing them to be able to make ends meet because it's rigged and wealth is not distributed fairly in this economy. Now, the other problem is with this depiction of drug addiction. And so, yes, there are certainly drug addicts out there that are so diseased that they can't help their compulsive behavior. They need the drug and they will do anything to get it. And they need help, not necessarily financial help. They certainly don't need to be enabled, but at the same time, they need some sort of help. And so, in both cases, the culture of cruelty says the best way to help somebody is to hurt them, to alienate them, isolate them, cut them off, and make them suffer because that's the only way they'll learn. So, another thing I was told, interestingly enough, at this little soiree is that back in the day, African American families were better off when there was slavery. Now, at this point, the racism is really out of the box. So, first of all, yes, it does sound like it's justifying slavery. Although the woman who was saying this was like, no, 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 no. I'm not saying that slavery is a good thing. I'm just stating a fact that during slave times, African Americans, their families held together. So this is insulting African Americans by saying that these days they can't hold their families together. And it's also kind of justifying slavery in a way that's saying, we were really kind of doing them a favor back in the day. And when you think about it, they should be grateful. And this is exactly what slaveholders were actually saying back when slavery was legal, that we are actually benefiting the Africans by bringing them over here and allowing them to work for us. So even if there are problems in African American families with single motherhood, and of course this is playing into a complete stereotype that doesn't often hold true, even if that is a problem, you don't deal with it by judging and condemning people, and you certainly don't say they were better off when a bunch of white people were running their lives with whips and chains. You know, we routinely sold family members off to different owners, right? Right? But of course, the culture of cruelty always blames the victims and never looks at the systemic causes for why the problems exist in the first place. So, I was teaching a class and we were talking about, the Trail of Tears and the oppression of Native American populations. So another teacher was just passing by and she overheard me and she really felt the need to step into my class and interrupt me because I guess I was just spreading woke propaganda, right? And we can't have that in public school classroom because that's spreading a false narrative. That's only one side of the story. So she comes into my classroom to say, hey, we really need to look at this in a very, very balanced way. There were some Indians that maybe did suffer under the Trail of Tears and relocation from their tribal lands and all that sort of stuff, but there were others that benefited, and we need to tell their story too, because we must have this fair and balanced approach to cultural and physical genocide of indigenous peoples. Wow. And so again, you see these ready-made rationalizations for injustice. We're doing you a favor by punishing you. And so just like slaveholders felt that they were doing the slaves a favor by enslaving them, so did us white people think we were doing the Indians a favor by completely obliterating their culture, turning them into white people, moving them off of their tribal lands, and basically destroying their entire culture and way of living. So another rationalization I heard from another teacher, specifically about homeless people, but it could apply just as well to slaves or the poor or really any oppressed people, is that, you know what? People just get used to deprivation and living in miserable conditions. Therefore, it's really kind of cruel when you think about it to actually help them, because then you're taking them out of their comfort zone, the life they're used to. And this is a great catch-all blanket justification for the whole culture of cruelty, right? And a lot of times this is coming from people that have had horrible childhoods themselves. They really did suffer. They were poor, struggling, and somehow you get this kind of poor versus poor hatred and judgment, especially along racial lines where you've got the white poor hating on the black poor. And sometimes that's by design, really. But I, Dr. Pontificus, digress. Listen, it doesn't matter whether you're used to misery. It still takes its toll. This teacher was arguing that you shouldn't help homeless people because they don't want help. They're used to that wonderful hobo lifestyle. And that is an utter fabrication. Most homeless are mentally ill. Homelessness is full of deprivation and abuse, and a lot of times sexual abuse. It's a horrible, hellish life. It doesn't matter whether you're used to it or not. It's hurting you emotionally and psychologically and physically, and that is not okay. It is not okay to see people suffer and walk away. And it's especially not okay to see people suffer and say, well, they deserve what they get. If they're homeless, they put themselves there. And not only that, the culture of cruelty says that the basic act of compassion, of just feeling compassion, hurts both you and those you are trying to help. And that is sick and twisted and wrong. So, even if you can make a case that parents, from their bad decisions, their inability to get it together, deserve to live in misery and suffering and deprivation, well, is it okay for their children to go through that? And yes, we do have institutions that directly take care of children, including the one I do, which is public education. And we supply free lunches and stuff for children in poverty. There are some supports there. But nonetheless, these kids are still being punished. And the only way you can make sense that these kids deserve the misery of poverty is that it's just bad genetics. That the sins of the parents, their weaknesses, are bad character traits that were genetically inherited, and they're going to pass those on to their children. And now you go full circle right back to social Darwinism. Let them die off, because social Darwinism is just the foundation for the next step, which is eugenics, which is not just about breeding better human beings, but also about stemming the tide of a bad gene pool by letting the worst of us die off and not procreate. And of course, it's really easy to understand how the Nazis were very, very into social Darwinism. And so are white supremacists and pretty much any brand of supremacists that you can think of. All right, so the last thing I heard from my outspoken libertarian friend is that happiness is subjective and therefore doesn't really exist. And certainly it can't be the basis for a society. I think the argument here was, serial killers might have a different definition of happiness, and therefore, because their definition of happiness would be different from yours, then it's just all up in the air. It's a free-for-all. And these are the kinds of so-called arguments that I hear, full of so many logical fallacies that I can't even keep track of them all. It's so hard to try to stay rational in the face of all this irrationality. And so let's get something straight. Happiness can be defined and tested for. Among other things, you can test for levels of stress hormones, and the bigger stress is, the less happy you are. And you can see that our society is creating stress and anxiety at an alarming rate, which means that we are decreasing our happiness while at the same time completely deciding that happiness shouldn't even be a thing at all right? Pretty much every mental illness on earth produces an absence of happiness. And guess what, crazy conservatives? Your hate-fueled culture of cruelty is making you unhappy too. But I guess with your sadomasochistic obsession, you kind of like it that way. And so every time I try to argue against these things, I try to do it respectfully, and I think I've just kind of run out. I don't want to be a hater at all, but I do think I've kind of hit the point where instead of trying to convince people that these beliefs are wrong and toxic, I just need to try to protect others from the damage their ideas do. So out of this concern I have for my fellow human beings, I am accused of having white guilt and, of course, of being a bleeding heart liberal. Both of these things, of course, I kind of wear as a badge of honor, but they're also sort of twisted logically. So, white guilt. The rationale for that is that I'm simply trying to make myself feel better by caring about people that are less better off than me and who don't have power and privilege that I have. This assumes that I deserve the power and privilege that I have, but I just kind of feel bad about it. Just because I can't reconcile the fact that we live in a world that is just naturally unequal, and I just happen to be a little bit higher than somebody else. So I should just get used to it already. Stop whining about it. Stop whining about the fact that there's a lot of people that are suffering out there. The end. No guilt, no empathy, no compassion, no change. And so it occurred to me during all these exchanges with my fellow teachers that conservatives are intensely looking for reasons to not care about others. while blaming and shaming me for seeking reasons to care. And it really comes down to one of the first things my libertarian friend said to me. I was stating the basic fact that morality is all about how you treat others. And his reply was, "Who says that's what morality is?" And this is, of course, a fundamental stance of libertarianism. And of course, I wanted to say that's the definition of morality. But this is a basic right-wing strategy right now to simply undefine words and concepts like morality and happiness, and thus undermine the thoughts and beliefs beneath them in order to rewire the conscience of America. And this is how you make the culture of cruelty universal and make thoughts of compassion and equality literally unthinkable. I'm sorry, but feeling someone else's pain is what makes us human. And creating policies to alleviate that pain makes society more humane. So the white guilt, bleeding heart liberal thing, I've heard this for a long, long time. It paints this picture of pouring out your heart, which should be a good thing, giving from an open heart, pouring out your sympathy and compassion. But for the twisted logic of the rabid right, being open-hearted means you're depriving yourself of, your vital life force or your resources or whatever. That when you open your heart, your kindness is basically going into a black hole of neediness that will literally bleed you dry. You really aren't making a change. You aren't really helping make a better world. You're just feeling bad and trying to clear your conscience by giving to people that don't deserve it because they'll take everything you have without contributing anything. The culture of cruelty. So there's a couple of myths here that support this. One is the zero-sum myth, which says that if you get more, I get less. That there's one pie, and if you make your slice of the pie a little bigger, then mine gets a little bit smaller, and that's not how modern economics works at all. The other myth, and we'll talk about this over and over and over again, is that compassion is actually a form of weakness, that it makes you vulnerable, and when you're kind to people, it gives them an excuse to victimize you, and that's simply not the case. Now, sometimes, people will take advantage of you, but you can't be, stupid about kindness. But compassion as an attitude is actually incredibly strong. But the thought on the rabid right is that I have to take kindness and compassion out of my personality. Nice guys finish last, as they say, or I have to reserve it only for the people who have passed some kind of worthiness test, and then I can be kind to those people that I know and trust. And surprise, those people are most likely to be very similar to me in terms of, my ethnic identity, my politics, and those sorts of things. So it's only okay to be kind to people that are the same as me. See how it works? Good old in-group bias. Ancient and powerful for the barbarian baboon inside of us all. Listen, there are countless other rationalizations for the culture of cruelty. They're everywhere, all the time. These are just the ones I've been afflicted with recently. So let's look at the usual victims of the culture of cruelty: homeless people, prisoners, the sick, right? Basically, anyone who suffers is by definition weak in some way and therefore undeserving. It really doesn't matter why, because what you can't do is blame the system. And what you really can't do is blame the people at the top of the system. And there's a name for this grand rationalization for the culture of cruelty. It's called the just world hypothesis, or more accurately, the just world fallacy. It claims that the world just naturally sorts everybody out and they all end up where they're supposed to be. And if you end up at the top, then you deserve to be on top. And if you end up on the bottom, then you deserve to be on the bottom. And so you shouldn't interfere with this in any way. This is justice. This is fairness. This is the grand justification for the culture of cruelty and the economic system it supports. Yes, capitalism. Since the just world hypothesis pretends to describe the natural order of things, therefore you have to be vociferously against things like healthcare and welfare, because the only legitimate function of government, I guess, if you eliminate all those things that help people, is to hurt people through things like law enforcement and the military. And of course, provide support and aid for corporations and businesses and banks in the interests of the rich and powerful. And that's all government is supposed to do. It can't help people. It's okay if you want to spend billions of dollars on ways to blow people up, but if you want to actually spend money to support people and improve their lives, no, that's bad. So, ironically, ordinary folks on the rabid right want to live in this cruel world because they feel like that's what everyone deserves, including themselves. The people who inflict cruelty have earned their right to do so, and their victims have earned punishment for their failures. And frankly, they should feel they're better off for it. Now, in psychology, we call this sadomasochism. And it makes me wonder, does the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is the basis for moral conduct, does it even work in this worldview? Because it seems to me that a lot of them are saying, I would want you to hurt me if I made a mistake. I would want to suffer because suffering is going to make me better. You hurt me by helping me. So how does ethics work in a world that thinks pain is a good thing? So at last revealed is this Orwellian, bizarro world where misery is comfort, cruelty is kindness, hatred is love, compassion depletes the giver and enables the receiver. I get to victimize you, and you need to stop whining about it and appreciate the gift of suffering I'm bestowing upon you. So, in some situations, I suppose this could be decent advice, but, not when it comes to correcting systemic socioeconomic problems. Learning from my mistakes, that happens naturally as I go through life. We don't need a world where we go out of our way to inflict more suffering on people in order to help them learn some kind of big life lesson. That's not how it works, because suffering, after a while, becomes debilitating, numbing. It creates crisis. It crushes your spirit. And who's going to learn anything with their spirits crushed? Not me, and I've been there. Now, of course, conservatives deny that any kind of socioeconomic problems exist in the first place, except, of course, for the ones which affect the social institutions they support, like the military and financial institutions and law enforcement. Problems are always the result of individuals acting bad because they aren't being punished enough. And this is the conservative world, full of conflict and hatred, where some win and a lot lose, and the losers get kicked when they're down because losing is who they are. It's a world of never-ending suffering. And as long as it's happening to someone else, it's okay. And so, what the culture of cruelty does is it keeps narrowing the circle of compassion, making it closer and closer and closer to you and yours. When suffering happens to you, instead of blaming the system, you just blame whoever the scapegoat of the day is. I can't even keep track of who we're blaming for all of our problems these days. Of course, it's always the Mexicans all the time. Got to build a border wall or use ICE to round them all up. Or it's the Muslims trying to declare Sharia law in America. Or it's the LGBTQ community that are destroying the sanctity of marriage and heterosexual gender norms. All of these things just keep us blaming each other here on the ground and never looking up at the people at the top of the pyramid who are causing all the problems in the first place. Out of this, you see again the alpha world glorified and justified, this military attitude towards social interaction where it's all about conflict and control and domination. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I keep seeing radical libertarians and Christian nationalists coming out of the military, spouting all this anti-government, anti-poor rhetoric, which is really ironic since the military is part of the government, and in many cases, the military, aka the government, got them out of poverty in the first place. But instead of feeling compassion toward the poor, you look at the poor with condescension. Why didn't you do what I did? Why didn't you join up? Why didn't you get it together? And so I can't help you because helping you actually hurts you, and this is their world. Thank you, sir. Can I have another? Yet, even though in the sadomasochistic culture of cruelty you should be blaming yourself for your own suffering, people certainly find a way to blame everyone below them, everyone different from them. Meanwhile, the power elite laugh all the way to the bank, looking down upon all of us from their little gated communities and doing things that actually perpetuate the conflict, like trying to avoid tax burden or destroying government institutions, trying to not do their share, their fair share in the costs of social institutions. And of course, they'll do anything to avoid contributing to society except the part they're living in, okay? They refuse to help the undeserving. If those people were worthy, they wouldn't need help because then they would be one of us. See how it works? Circular logic at its finest. This contempt we have for the poor and suffering in this country is an ethical disease, a moral blight. How can a civilized people ignore each other's pain? And so, as I, Dr. Pontificus, have said before, the inability to feel someone else's feelings, to feel their pain, not only dehumanizes them, it also dehumanizes you. Both the victim and the perpetrator become less human. And when people who espouse this ideology start running society, which arguably they already do, then the society itself becomes less human. And so, again, if the poor are such willing parasites, why do they wish for dignity, even if they've dehumanized themselves from the self-fulfilling prophecy of being told over and over and over again that they're inferior and unworthy? Nonetheless, always, the core of humanity is still there. It's still here. And through care and respect, it can be strengthened. It's there in everyone. You may not think that. It doesn't matter. It's there whether you believe it, whether you believe in humanity or not. So, folks, time for a call to action, and that is reject the culture of cruelty. Start off by rejecting it in your heart. Then move out to being able to reject it in interactions with people that you know, and then with people that you don't know, and then move out to maybe influencing public policy in a more systemic way. You start with yourself and keep expanding your circle of compassion. This is the way. So again, start central, start local. We don't need to blame some evil mastermind that's pulling the strings here. This is just what happens when you create a culture that brings out the worst in people, that brings out the meanest parts of their spirit. It's sadomasochism disguised as an economic system. This is what happens when the right normalizes what would otherwise be called a psychological disorder. Yes, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Conservatives are literally insane. They are embracing pathological behavior. And that's not a good thing for the rest of us if they're the ones writing public policy. So it's not about the foxes running the hen house, it's about the inmates running the asylum. The system is programmed to create these conflicts between ordinary citizens, pitting us against each other. Not having enough to go around puts everyone at each other's throats. And I would put it to you that there actually is enough to go around. We just don't distribute it because we don't want to, okay? What creates the culture of cruelty? People buying into inequality, literally. So the whole point of human rights, of civilization itself, is to gradually but inevitably expand the circle of who we respect and relate to beyond the people that are just like us. That's what human rights, what democracy is really all about. This is the way. This is the way forward. And that's it for now, folks. I, the eponymous Pontificus, thank you for your kind attention. The Dr. Pontificus podcast comes to you from the deep, dark heart of the American Midwest. Our theme music is by the Great Orange Mothers, awesome Austin band from ages of yore. Until next time, fight the good fight, but don't be a hater. And remember, friends, please don't feed the alphas. Dr. Pontificus bids you good day.